The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Alicia Garza on what motivates black voters and why politicians should care. Alex Morgan on upping the progressive ground game in 2020. Plus, Bill Press on Donald Trump's perilous foreign policy with former UN Ambassador Susan Rice. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Alicia Garza reminds us that black voters are central to changing the direction of the nation, and that politicians who take black voters for granted do so at their own peril. And we say hello to Alicia Garza, principal at Black Futures Lab, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Global Network, director of strategy and partnerships at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and co-founder of Supermajority, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Alicia Garza, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. We have a lot to talk about as far as the different hats you wear. Let's start by having you tell us about the Black Futures Lab and its mission.
So the Black Futures Lab works to make black communities powerful in politics. And we do so through a strategy of being an experimentation and innovations lab where we look at new and innovative ways to engage, motivate, and activate black communities to build black political power. From our perspective, the challenges that face black communities are complex, and their solutions require innovation, experimentation, but most of all, they require black political power. And so that's what we're up to at the Black Futures Lab.
And of course, you have several projects. One of them is the Black Census Project, and it is the largest survey of black people conducted in the United States since Reconstruction. What are some of the most important insights that you've learned from this work so far?
Well, there's a few things that we learned, and I can say that, there were some things that were very surprising in the census, and there were other things that really reinforced things that we already knew. One of the big points that I think is important, especially as we go into, I think, one of the most important elections in my lifetime, is that black voters feel taken for granted. 50% of our more than 30,000 respondents from all 50 states said that they feel like politicians don't care about black people. Further, we found that even though black communities feel that that is true, that black communities are increasingly engaged in the political process. So that might be surprising to some folks coming out of 2016, even though black voter turnout was still very, very high. Some of the narratives that you heard from 2016, from the autopsy of it, is that the reason that the Democratic candidate didn't win is because black communities didn't turn out. But in fact, what we found was that black communities not only turned out to vote, but black communities were increasingly engaged in campaigning, in volunteering for campaigns, in donating and fundraising for campaigns, and in making sure that other black people in their community turned out to vote. And so I think what was important about the census and what we continue to try to push forward is this notion that there are a lot of stereotypes about black communities and how we participate that actually adversely impact our conditions. They adversely impact the ways in which we are engaged during election seasons and in between, and that actually can have detrimental impacts and effects on the conditions of black communities. So our argument coming out of the survey and having done an analysis of the results, is that Black communities are increasingly complex and that you cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach to engaging Black communities. Our demographics have changed greatly over the last 20 years. There's a growing population of Black people who are immigrants to the United States who are participating in various ways in the political process, but also Black immigrants who are being locked out from being able to participate in the democratic process. And there are communities within Black communities who are never asked to participate. So one thing I think is very interesting is that we found that Black communities who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming or gender non-binary are increasingly politically active. More than 70% said that over the last year that they'd participated in a protest or joined an organization. And yet when we look at the voting patterns for these same folks, their self-identified voting patterns, they're saying that they're not participating. And our hypothesis is that a lot of that is that these communities are not being asked. These doors are not being knocked. These phones are not being called. And so as a result, you have a population that has everything to gain from participating in the political process, and yet they're being left aside and left behind. So the Black census is important to us because it provides a nuanced picture of who Black communities are and what it is that we need in order to be powerful in our lives. And our assertion is that one of the major things that we need in order to be powerful in our lives is Black political power.
How frustrating for such, large swaths of communities across the country. I mean, that's just, and I don't understand it. But how do you hope to use the knowledge that you're gaining from the Black Census Project?
Well, I agree with you that it's absolutely infuriating, especially going into an election where turnout is everything. If we do not get every single person who can vote to turn out to vote, we can almost guarantee ourselves another 4 years of this current administration. And given the trajectory of this current administration, what we know is that they hope to hold power for quite a long time, longer than the usual term limits of a president in the United States. But with that being said, we're not taking this laying down. One of the things that we find to be really important is that we want to make sure that every Black person in this country who can participate does. And so what that's going to require is that we play a role in making sure that we are a trusted home for factual and accurate and detailed information about the issues impacting Black communities and where the candidates stand on those issues. We think it's critically important that we are reaching deeply into communities who are being left aside and left behind because people assume that they don't have a stake in the political process, and so why bother? And then finally, of course, we're looking at some of the key dynamics within Black communities that actually are being exploited by our opposition. And so one of the things that we know is that Black voters tend to vote incredibly progressively, especially when it relates to social issues. However, on economic issues, that level of engagement tends to change. The content of that engagement tends to change, and that's largely around issues of the economy. I can tell you that the number one issue that our survey respondents identified that was keeping them up at night was low wages that were not enough to support a family. And yet, on our side of things, people are not talking to Black communities as if we have a stake both in the lack of ability to keep a roof over our head or to get a job that pays above minimum wage, but also that is incredibly impacted and shaped by the ways that racism shapes our lives. And so for us, we are advancing a program in 2020 that we're calling Black to the Ballot. And that program is focused primarily on registering Black voters in 5 states across the country. We've said that we are going to register a minimum of 10,000 new Black voters from communities that have been left out and left behind. And then we're not going to stop there. We're going to make sure that from the process of signing up to vote all the way to the process of being able to cast your vote, that Black communities are engaged, motivated, and activated, and that we are playing our part to change the direction of this country.
And Alicia, last May, you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times titled, "Dear Candidates, here is what black people want. Given the work that campaigns do trying to know what voters want, shouldn't they already know what black people want?
I mean, you would think so, right? But what we found, of course, is that, again, there are ways and methods of engaging black communities that are not only highly ineffective, but they're rooted in racialized stereotypes that don't actually get to the root of the issues that black communities care about or face every day. You know, I can tell you I've been voting since I was 18. I was raised with the notion that because people like my mother, right, experienced Jim Crow and separate and unequal facilities, that the right and the power to vote was a non-negotiable for me, right? And so every election, whether it be municipal elections, state elections, or federal elections, I drag myself to vote. I registered as an absentee voter quite a few years ago, just for the ease of the process. And I can tell you, if I'm looking for accurate information about where candidates stand on issues that I care about, all I find is photo ops with plates of soul food, often uneaten fried chicken, greens, and mac and cheese, which, first of all, it's a crime that those things end up just being used as props and not ingested because they're incredibly delicious.
I agree with you there.
But also what I find is that candidates don't want to engage with me and people like me in substantive ways. The way that they think it's important to appeal to me is either through the traditional foods of my culture, or through other culturally symbolic means, whether it be doing the Dougie on talk shows, right, that I might watch, or whether it means throwing concerts, right, with popular entertainers that I might listen to. But nowhere in the process is there a real deep engagement about how that candidate plans to remove the barriers that keep me from accessing the things that I need to live and to live with dignity. So, and our opposition is doing it quite well. Our opposition is talking to black communities about criminal justice reform and talking about how they've made changes in the criminal system in order to make sure that black communities are not over-policed and over-incarcerated. Our opposition is talking to black communities about why the economy isn't working for them. And to be frank, I over my time as an active voter, I can say I don't vote Republican. And the majority of black communities don't vote Republican. But it does get tiring time and time again to vote along the lines of a party that literally has not engaged you in a deep and substantive way and in a consistent way over time, and not just when we need something from them. And so for us at the Black Futures Lab and from the Black to the Future Action Fund, which is a C4 organization, it's important to us to change that dynamic. What we say is that it's actually not about these candidates and it's not about parties. It's fundamentally about our ability to make decisions over our lives and the lives of people that we care about. It's fundamentally about being able to move resources to the things that we need and to the things that enrich our communities. And frankly, our task, not only this year, but moving forward, if we hope to change the political tide in this country, is changing how politics happens in our communities. And so we've got a number of initiatives at the Black Futures Lab and at the Action Fund that are trying to get directly to that. And we think that these are resources for candidates and campaigns themselves. Our survey process, having the largest survey of black people in America in 155 years, is a gold mine for candidates and campaigns who can't quite figure out what it is that black communities want besides photo ops with plates of soul food. Our Black Agenda that we'll be releasing later this month is a gold mine for candidates to understand what are the top issues that are important to black communities. And I'll give you a hint, it's not just criminal justice reform. And our reach, because we've deeply engaged these communities, not just online, but through partnerships with organizations in 28 states across this country that have large populations of black people, our partnerships are a gold mine for candidates and campaigns to better understand how Black communities need to be engaged, but also what are the factions and contours of our communities so that you don't try and use a one-size-fits-all approach.
It's mind-boggling to me that we're having this conversation in the second decade of the 21st century. It's crazy. We're speaking with Alicia Garza, the principal at Black Futures Lab, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Global Network, and director of strategy and partnerships at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, co-founder of Supermajority, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Now, Alicia, you touched on some of these things a little earlier. There are myths about Black voters that need to be dispelled. For example, Black voters cannot be counted on to turn out to vote. What's wrong with this assumption?
Well, there's lots of things wrong with this assumption, including that Black voters cannot be counted on. I can tell you that in the last 3 election cycles, Black voters have played a decisive role in the outcomes of elections, whether it be the election of the first Black president ever in the history of this country, to the upsets in Alabama and unseating an accused pedophile, to shifting to a supermajority in Virginia and a majority of women of color legislators and leaders, all the way to, increasing voter engagement and voter turnout in places like Florida and Georgia, where we saw the fear around that, right, which led the opposition candidates to literally steal the election in front of America's eyes. And so I think for us, what we think is important in this next election cycle is for Black voters not to be taken for granted. I think what we know, and if we haven't learned this already, then we're really behind the curve, is that Black voters are critical to advancing any progressive policy in the United States. But Black voters, because we've been ignored largely by the infrastructure of the Democratic Party, are increasingly susceptible, right, to the messaging and outreach and engagement from our opposition. I have to be very honest. Every community has wedge issues that they can be mobilized around, whether it be same-sex marriage or same-sex relationships, abortion, immigration. And even though that's true, Black voters have still held the line. Black voters have still continued to say we won't be divided from our immigrant brothers and sisters because we are also immigrants. Black voters have said, my religion may tell me that abortion is wrong, but at the end of the day, I don't believe that that is a choice that the government should make for somebody's family. And Black voters have also said, right, that it is increasingly important for people to be able to shape and live their own lives and to love who they want, even if their religious convictions tell them something different. But over time, if a group of people that is critical, right, to advancing your aims isn't organized, isn't invested in, isn't followed up with, and the leadership in those communities isn't developed, it leaves those communities wide open for what we call counterattacks. Right? And I think we've seen some of that rising up in the last 2 years, whether it be, Blacks for Trump, whether it be some, very notable Black celebrities like Kanye West or Isaiah Washington really trying to dive into these places where Black voters are rightfully disengaged because they've been disenfranchised, whether that be from voter suppression or gerrymandering, or whether it simply be a lack of investment and resources in communities where people's doors aren't getting knocked by major campaigns who cannot afford to lose one vote. And so moving into this election cycle, I think it's important for us to remember 2 things. One, you will ignore Black voters at your own peril. And 2, engagement is not a election-to-election process. It is a year-round process where you continue to invest in communities even when there is not an election happening. If we don't heed these 2 very important points, I can almost guarantee that not only will there be an extension of the current administration, but I can almost even guarantee that there will be a continued erosion of the democracy that we hold so dear.
And as you mentioned, there is that other assumption that black voters, they will always vote or go largely Democrat. But do Democrats presume too much? Because it sounds to me like that is the case, and that's part of what happened in 2016, perhaps? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Democrats do, and I should say, obviously Democrats are complex themselves. But, those of us who are thinking about black voters in a way that is narrow do so at our own peril. The reality is you cannot take anything for granted with black voters. There's a lot of examples from this cycle alone, right, which started almost a year earlier than it usually does. And there were candidates in the field on the Democratic side that people assumed would automatically have the black vote. And what we have found over time is that that's just not true, whether that be, Senator Harris's campaign, right, which everyone assumed would generate a lot of black support. And then there are some that we're being surprised by, right? Like, I don't know if I'm surprised, but there's increasingly reports about black voter support for Joe Biden. We should be assured that that support is actually for President Obama. And
right.
If there is kind of an increased support that is being indicated by polling, a lot of that has to do with name recognition and not policy. But with the continued thinning out of the field and alongside of it, a continued thinning out of candidates of color and women, I think what you're finding is that there's no guarantee where the black vote will go on the Democratic side or if it will go on the Democratic side at all. What we know, again, is that the values that this party espouses tend to be the closest to the values that black voters hold, with few exceptions. But it's not a guarantee that because those values are aligned, that black people will be motivated to turn out. And so one of the things that we've done to try and address this is we've taken the data from the Black Census Project and we have transformed that into a black political agenda. This is an agenda that makes very explicit what it is that black communities care about. It makes very explicit the role and impact of race and gender and class and sexuality on those issues that black voters care about and experience every day. And it also offers a roadmap to how candidates and their campaigns should start to think about policy that can transform those dynamics. One of the things that we say in our black political agenda is that frankly, if we're really serious about transforming the lives of all Americans, then we have to have race-forward policies and not race-neutral ones. Race-neutral ones leave communities aside and they leave communities behind. Race-forward policies look at the specific impacts of race and gender and class on people's everyday lives, their experiences, their wages, their ability to access school and housing, and their ability to, frankly, to access the kinds of jobs that they need to keep a roof over their head and to keep their families whole and to keep their families together. And so, I do think that, again, we're in January of 2020. We don't have that much time, but we do have a lot of time at the same time. And it would really behoove the party and the campaigns and the candidates that are running under the banner of this party to really do some deep introspection about what else we can do in order to authentically engage and activate black communities. Because if we don't, again, it will be to our peril.
Yeah, they need a listening campaign. Listen to what the people are telling you. Before
Correct.
we let you go, there's another assumption that I'd like to touch on, and that is there are black issues that only affect black people. These are often issues that concern institutional racism and economic justice. What's wrong with segregating those issues as black concerns?
Well, the thing that's fascinating to me is that there are not black issues, there are issues, right? And there are issues that impact black communities differently because of the presence and the pervasiveness of racism. We talk about this similarly with women, right? Where we just had a debate that had an all woman identified moderator panel. And there were conversations happening on the stage that don't generally happen. People talking about childcare, people talking about equal pay. And it wasn't just the women who had to address these issues. But what we found was that because people have segregated issues into demographics, then in some ways what happens is that because those demographics lack power and therefore lack importance in the political process, the muscle of talking about how you would solve problems that uniquely impact a particular segment of our country, it's a pretty weak muscle. And so, when we talk about issues that face all Americans, like low wages, like lack of access to quality and affordable housing, like lack of access to quality and affordable education or healthcare, we tend to approach it in a way where we say one solution will lift all boats, and actually, in fact, many of our campaigns have kind of started to talk about issues in a trickle-down way, right? We keep having this fight about whether it's class or race, whether it's class or gender. And the reality is lots of us live our lives where it is all of those things at the same time. And we're not able to separate one day we're a woman and the other day we're black and then the other day we're poor. Like we're all those things at the same time. And being all of those things at the same time shape our life chances, and they shape and impact our lives and our families. So wages are an issue that Black communities care about deeply. It just so happens, because of the pervasiveness of racism, that Black communities and Black women, for example, in particular, tend to make at least 20 cents less on the dollar than white women do. That doesn't mean that wages are just a white issue or just a Black issue, but it does mean that addressing the issue of the discrepancy in wages has to be nuanced in such a way where you have to look at how do we close the gaps between white women and white men, but also how do we not stop there, knowing that Black women and Latinx women and Indigenous women and trans women are even farther down the totem pole than that. Our approach to this, again, is race-forward, gender-forward policies that literally start at the bottom, knowing that when you start with the people who are most impacted and closest to the pain of the problem, that you will expand opportunities for everybody who experiences it, from the trans woman who can't access the formal economy, all the way up to the white woman who can't break the glass ceiling so many years later. That is our approach to how to shape and build policy, and we are fighting tooth and nail to get campaigns and candidates to walk with us on this path, knowing that it is the only way that we will motivate and activate people to actually get out and vote and feel like there's a different conversation happening than has been for the last 20 years.
Alicia Garza, principal at Black Futures Lab, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Global Network, director of strategy and partnerships at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and co-founder of Supermajority and co-founder of Black Lives Matter, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Alicia, we very much enjoyed having you with us today and would love to have you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what the Democrats got wrong in 2016 and what they need to get right in 2020. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
I'm guessing that being rich is a comfortable feeling. No money worries. You're set for life. But is it possible that too rich can be too much, even discombobulating? Imagine being Mark Zuckerberg, whose social media monopoly, Facebook, put another $27 billion in his pocket last year. Forget fundamental questions about whether he or anyone is worthy of such an excessive haul of the world's wealth. How do you spend it? Mansions, yachts, jets, jewels, a Picasso painting, your personal island, and other trinkets barely dent your multi-billionist windfall. And since the Trumpeteers drastically slashed your taxes, far less of your extraordinarily good fortune is diverted to public need and America's common good. Thus, the bulk of your booty goes to making you even richer. You buy out other corporations and advanced technologies. You dump billions into Wall Street, artificially jacking up the price of stocks you own. Your wealth expands exponentially, inequality spreads, and the egalitarian ideals that hold our huge, diverse society together are stretched to the breaking point. Interestingly, more and more uber-rich individuals are comprehending the ultimate consequences of such extreme selfishness, so they're responding with extreme consumerism. Specifically, they've created a boom in the sale of maximum security, James Bondish armored vehicles. Priced in the $500,000 range, these rolling fortresses can come with 700 horsepower engines, tailpipe to grill anti-blast protection, door handles that can electrocute intruders, roof-mounted gun turrets, and room for 10 fully equipped bodyguards. This is Jim Hightower saying these armored beasts have become the preferred ride of billionaires, not to flaunt their fortunes, but to fend off the masses they've ripped off.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Alex Morgan says that in 2016, Democrats forgot the basics of winning campaigns, face-to-face conversations with voters. That's why he's leading a massive effort to turn that around. And we say hello to Alex Morgan, Executive Director of the Progressive Turnout Project. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote in Newsweek about what the Democrats got wrong in 2016 and what they need to get right in 2020. Basically, you wrote that Democrats failed to put in the hard work of campaigning. But what does that mean?
Yeah, so if we go back to the fall of 2016, nobody, I think including Donald Trump, thought he was going to be elected president. So much so that there wasn't enough time and there weren't enough resources placed into what we wrongly termed blue wall states, like my home state of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So in the aftermath, we heard state parties openly talking about how they didn't have enough staff and support in the 2016 election. And we know that the candidate herself didn't spend as much time in these states as, previous candidates like Barack Obama, John Kerry, Al Gore. And, maybe we looked too much to the good times like 2008, where we won some of these states in double digits, and forgot that they can be closer than that, forgot that they are shrinking, losing population, and becoming a little more conservative every year as a result. And so you combine that with a drop in turnout, and you create the perfect storm that sent Donald Trump to the White House. So these states and state parties in particular needed more resources, needed a stronger ground game with more organizers and more volunteers. And fortunately, I think in the aftermath, we've seen these state parties and their new leaders recognize that they had to start the work in 2017 to win this year in 2020. So excited about all the work that they have been doing and that we're going to do this year.
So it ends up being a wake-up call, I guess, on some levels.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you also wrote that political consultants have wrongly convinced Democratic candidates that the way to reach voters is through expensive, flashy TV ads. How do we know that this strategy doesn't work?
Yeah, so that's a big reason why we started Progressive Turnout Project. My political partner, Harry, and I had been part of many political campaigns where when we entered the GOTV or get out the vote phase of the campaign, every training always includes some statistics about why quality conversations are the best way to boost voter turnout. And so after a few campaign cycles, we wondered why we weren't investing in this work earlier than September and October. And, when you go to the footnotes in those presentations and you find the statistics, you see that Professors Alan Gerber and Don Green really pioneered much of the modern political research. And in their book, Get Out the Vote, they highlight their own case studies where they found that TV, radio ads, and robocalls in particular don't help to boost turnout. They can help with persuasion, but they don't help with turnout. So here at Progressive Turnout Project, we continue in that tradition. And to date, nearly every program we've run has been a randomized control trial, a field experiment. And we've almost exclusively invest in field programs, on-the-ground programs. But we've done some digital ads, some social pressure mail, some phone calls as well. And just time and time again, we found that putting staff on the ground who are having face-to-face conversations with voters is what best boosts turnout. And last year, even amid the blue wave, when we thought, okay, people are really going to show up, is our work really going to have that much of an impact? We found that on average, our programs were still boosting turnout among our target voters by 10.4%. So, these are folks who are likely to vote Democratic, but they need that nudge to go and vote.
Sure.
So we're really proud of that.
Yeah, and I think you should be, and I think it is a message that carries on from where this whole thing started with Progressive Turnout Project. And the goal, of course, of the project, connect with voters and get Democrats out to vote. And there's the key right there, is connecting with the voters. And you've got a well-developed strategy based on a wealth of research. What can we learn from research that will boost turnout among progressive voters?
Yeah, bingo. So we focus on having those authentic and personal conversations with voters, and I think that's the biggest lesson folks can learn from our work. So when we were on the ground 2018, 2 years ago now, campaigns were able to win in traditionally conservative places like Orange County, where we elected a progressive in Katie Porter, because across the board, Democrats, including the staff working on our program there and our voter turnout fellows who we placed with the Porter campaign, met with voters at their doorsteps and had authentic conversations about the issues that those voters cared about, and then talked about voting and why it was so important to get out and vote. We hired local organizers and engaged folks who stayed home in 2016 on those important issues like education, like healthcare. And it's how we, broaden the base of the party. Voters need to feel heard and valued, or they'll stay home. And the presidential candidates that have broken through and now have followed that model, and as a result have surged in the polls and built small armies of small dollar donors and volunteers, and that's what we all need to do in 2020.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of your on-the-ground strategy, it revolves around a simple idea: convince someone to vote. And that begins with a conversation. Again, how does that conversation start, though?
Sure. So when we're knocking on doors, we know that the best thing to do beyond having that face-to-face conversation is when we're talking with these infrequent Democratic voters to have a non-candidate specific message, right? We're not the campaign, and so we are able to broaden our topics a little bit. We focus our resources on talking again about the issues that we know those voters care about, and we actually ask open-ended questions when we start our program in May and June to survey voters. We sort of frame ourselves more as a survey than a get out the vote program when we launch, so that folks can think about that first time or the most recent time they went out to vote. What is it that motivated them to get out and vote? If they still care about that, or how they've seen candidates and their local governments, engage in that, and why that means it's so important to go out and vote again. So we end that early conversation with a commitment to vote, where a voter signs a commit to vote card. I'm sure a lot of folks who now are very familiar with that concept. We mail that back to them ahead of Election Day, and we leave them with an I'm a voter window cling so that they've got something to remember that conversation by. Of course, that's not the only time that we interface with those voters. We know that repeated contact with folks is really important. So we come back in August and September to start talking with them about how to go and vote and to know all the steps they need to take to make sure they're able to cast their ballot. And then in that final traditional GOTV window of time, we take, one more knock to make sure they remember to get to the polls.
Now, and my understanding is, beyond that first conversation, as you're alluding to, you actually help voters write a plan. So what does that entail?
Yeah, so it's a lot of the fundamentals of, who, what, when, where, why, right, that you learn in elementary school. Voting should be easy, but in a lot of places we know local officials and state officials put up barriers. So it's a lot about making sure that most folks think that their polling place never changes. And in a lot of cases, that's true. It may not change, but we like to confirm that information in our later conversation with folks, confirm where they can vote. A lot of folks, especially in places where early voting has come online, Michigan, for example, passed a ballot initiative in 2018 where folks will be able to, submit an absentee vote or go early vote for no reason. And so a lot of folks won't know that that's an option. So we put that whole menu of options out there for voters. And then we get it all written down on a takeaway magnet. Just like I said, we leave that window cling in our early conversations. We give voters a magnet that they can stick on their fridge, or, if they've got a metal frame door, or wherever they are going to see it, to remind them, when is Election Day? When did I say I was going to go vote? Where is it that I'm going? And we tack on there, too. We encourage them to bring a friend. So we hope that they're doubling their numbers as well.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea. And when you think about it, it's just kind of one of those, gosh, I could have had a V8. Why didn't I come up with this idea? We're speaking with Alex Morgan, Executive Director of the Progressive Turnout Project. This is remarkably time-consuming work, though. It requires a lot of people to make it work. How big is your operation?
Yeah, so this year we are really excited to have our biggest program ever. We're going to have at least 66 field offices, including in 12 states where Senate races are on the ballot. We took back the House, but if a Democratic president who we're going to elect is going to get anything done, we've got to win in places like Colorado, Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, and on and on. And then, of course, we're in those big battleground presidential states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We're going to be in Florida. And we're going to have about 1,100 staff nationwide. So in total, it's a little more than a $45 million investment. We think we're going to knock at least 7.1 million doors. So we are bigger and better than ever, and just want to make sure we're doing everything we can to win up and down the ticket this year.
What is your sense, Alex, now that progressive candidates are listening to your message and are willing to up their ground game to connect with voters in meaningful ways?
I'm feeling really optimistic. I hope that if folks who are listening to your program know of folks who might be a good fit for our field programs, we would love for them to go to turnoutpac.org/jobs. And if they don't, just want to make sure that they're getting engaged early and often to knock as many doors as they can, have as many conversations as they can. Every single meaningful voter contact is going to make a difference in this election. So I'm feeling really optimistic about the work that we're going to do here at PTP and what our whole Democratic coalition is going to do across the board between now and November 3rd.
Well, I mean, it's a great idea. It's proving itself right now, and we wish you continued success. And again, if you want to check it out and you want to get involved, turnoutpac.org/jobs to find out more. Alex Morgan, Executive Director of the Progressive Turnout Project, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Alex, thank you so much for your time with us. We'd love to have you back down the road and kind of get an update on how things are working out.
We'll be happy to do that and share with you what we're hearing on the ground.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with former UN Ambassador Susan Rice about Donald Trump's disdain for diplomacy and why she supports a war powers resolution to curb more military actions against Iran.
You have a house in Maine. Why aren't you running for the U.S. Senate? And is it too late to change your mind?
Where to begin? First of all, there is a wonderful woman named Sarah Gideon, who's a Speaker of the House in Maine, who is running and who I think is very deserving of our support. That's one reason. Mm-hmm. And yes, I do think it's probably a little bit late. I thought about it, actually. And I thought about it first and foremost from a personal perspective, because for 8 years of my daughter's life, I was either living and working in New York City and trying to get home on the weekends, or working in the White House and barely able to get home to see her and her older brother. And then of my son, who's 5.5 years older than our daughter, he experienced the latter half of the Clinton administration. And our priority was really to be sure that if I was going to reconsider getting back into public service, that it was at a time that made sense for the kids in particular. And our daughter is a junior in high school. And this really was not the time either to uproot her or abandon her again. And so that was the first and foremost reason. There are other reasons as well. We do have a house in Maine. It was my mother's house. My mother's family, the Dixons, as I write in the book, were immigrants to Maine who came from Jamaica in 1912. And so our family history goes back over 100 years in Maine, and most of it with a continuous presence of our family there. But believe it or not, for all good reason also, Maine is one of those states that's particularly sensitive to people who come from outside. And it doesn't count having family ties, property, summer residence, and having spent all my childhood summers there. I haven't spent all of my adult and childhood years there, and that counts for something up there.
Not good enough. Huh? So I really want to dive into the book with you, but first, while you're here, there are some breaking news of the moment that we might talk a little bit about. How serious do you weigh the situation in Iran today? Did we escape war? You wrote in the New York Times a few days ago that you didn't see any other way out except ending in war. Do you still believe that? Where are we today?
Well, I said it's hard to envision how we get out of this. Was before, after the killing of Soleimani and before the initial Iranian response. I'm very concerned still. I think it was, on balance, as bad as Soleimani was, a very ill-considered decision to take that opportunity of the strike, particularly to do it inside of Iraq. And I think if you look at the consequences already, our interests have been substantially set back. We are under enormous pressure now to leave Iraq on terms that are not favorable to our interests. And in fact, that was what Soleimani was trying to accomplish. He was primarily trying to get the United States out of Iraq and the wider region. We've had to suspend our fight against ISIS, which is the reason we're there in the first place. And that, too, is, I think, a very important setback to our interests and our security posture. And then, of course, the Iranians have accelerated their steps to abrogate their responsibilities under the nuclear deal. And there's no obvious route to stem that momentum or to find a way back now. And so that's deeply concerning. So on all three of those critical fronts, directly as a result of the Soleimani strike, we're further from the ability to shore up our interests. And then, of course, regrettably but predictably, we need to be prepared for the likelihood that the Iranians are far from done in their retaliation. It will likely not, in the near term, take an overt form like the very unusual acknowledgement by them of the missile strikes and using ballistic missiles coming out of Iran. But we're more likely to see more proxy attacks, cyber attacks, and potentially terrorist attacks against American targets, both military, diplomatic, and potentially civilian. So as somebody who's watched the region for quite a while, I think we have to be braced for months, quite frankly, if not years, for the possible manifestations of their retaliation.
One would assume that were you in the White House as National Security Advisor with a different president, you would not have recommended or even given the option of assassinating Soleimani. Were you there today looking to move forward and somehow develop some kind of an ongoing relationship with Iran, what advice would you give to the president?
There's a major contradiction in your question.
No, that's right. I understand. I didn't mean necessarily this president.
Well, I mean, it really matters which president it is.
True.
Because if it's
Yes.
this president,
Good point.
Given his disdain for diplomacy and his oft-demonstrated willingness to walk away from commitments, it's very hard to see how under this president there's any path to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Plus, for all the political reasons he's so disparaged the nuclear deal, even though he lacks any alternative to address the problem as effectively as the nuclear deal did, at least the nuclear program itself. It didn't purport to deal with the other aspects of our substantial concerns about Iran's behavior. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I hope that through various channels, there's the Swiss, there's potentially the French and the Japanese. There's an Iranian ambassador in New York with whom we have had dialogue in the past. And as I write in Tough Love, early in the Obama administration, I was asked to establish a secret channel to the Iranian ambassador. That this was long before we were into the negotiations on the nuclear deal, but to be able to pass messages directly. And so that's another place where we could open a channel, discreetly or not discreetly. And the Iranian ambassador to the UN now Ravanchi was very much involved in the nuclear negotiations. So he's somebody who's substantively familiar with the issues at hand and plugged into senior leadership back in Tehran.
You mentioned the nuclear deal several times. Is that really the undoing of the nuclear deal, pulling out where this whole present crisis began?
I believe so. We have had long-standing concerns about Iran's support for terrorism, its effort to destabilize neighboring states, its human rights record, all of that, its missile program. Those are all very real and ongoing concerns. But we were able to mitigate the Iranian threat to allies, partners in the region, and particularly Israel, but the Gulf states and beyond, because all of those threats that we still have to contend with are greatly exacerbated when Iran has nuclear weapons or the capacity to acquire them quickly. When we pulled out without a plan B and put crushing, crippling additional sanctions on unilaterally, not only did we alienate ourselves from our European partners and the others who had signed on to the deal, but we really boxed the Iranians in and gave them very few options. And yet, for a year, they withheld any reneging on their commitments and worked to try to find a pathway around our objections with the Europeans. That didn't bear fruit. The administration continued to up the pressure. And that's when the Iranians began, as those of us who know the region would have predicted, to act out in military forms that led to these sort of small-scale tit-for-tat escalations that then, morphed into something more substantial.
The Senate is about to consider a measure by Senator Tim Kaine to put some limits on the president's war powers, meaning he has to withdraw all troops. It's got 30 days to notify Congress or get all troops out. Having been there with President Clinton, with President Obama, and you talk in the book about in Somalia where the Congress stepped up to say, no, we want our troops out of Somalia.
Stepped in, I would say.
Stepped in, I would say, right? Yeah, right. So is this that Kaine measure something you would support, and you think it's what the Senate ought to do?
In this instance, yes. I, as one who spent her career in the executive branch, it sort of runs against my instincts to want to see, executive authorities
right
ceded to the Article I branch. But in this case, because the administration has approached Congress with such extraordinary disdain, refusing to share information, refusing to provide serious briefings, even to the most highly cleared members of Congress. I was up on Capitol Hill last week and met with members of the Democratic caucus in one of their large sessions, and the level of fury and frustration that they feel about their inability to just do their jobs and serve their constituents because they don't have the basic information that they are entitled to was just off the charts. And it's not how the system is supposed to function. And when you add to that, that this is an administration who's refused to provide witnesses and refused to provide documents, and it thumbs its nose at subpoenas, and has now twice took us to the brink of open war with Iran without any authorization, this first time being when we were 10 minutes from striking, the second time being, last week. I think Congress has every reason to be deeply concerned, and there is no current legal authorization for a full-out war with Iran. Technically, the president has the authority to respond to in a defensive fashion to imminent threats, which is why this whole imminence debate is relevant. Turns out it appears there was not an imminent threat in the form that is typically understood. But leaving that aside, and the Kaine resolution is careful not to prevent the president from acting in self-defense. It would if enacted, and it won't be, even though it seems like there are enough Republican members, senators now who are willing to vote for it such that it will pass the Senate by a narrow margin. It's not going to get, obviously, the president's support. So it won't become law. But I do think this is an extraordinary circumstance where it is the right thing.
Right. To what extent is the central part of the problem the fact that you have a president who is totally inexperienced in foreign policy, plus a hothead, plus acts on impulses rather than reason or evidence?
That would be part of the problem.
Yeah. But I mean, kind of that is the problem, isn't it? And also maybe that not only is he lacks that experience, but the people around, he has not put people around him who have much more, or people that we can have confidence in or trust. But what do you think of his foreign policy team? Secretary Pompeo.
Let me start with the president.
Okay.
Recall at the convention his famous line, "I alone can fix it." And his repeated statements that he doesn't need the advice or the counsel of anybody else. It's only his view that matters. And that's, when he says that, he's speaking honestly, it would seem. And that's a huge problem because he's never done this before. He has literally no prior government experience, much less foreign policy experience. He hasn't served. And he could give a damn about facts and analysis. And he refuses to absorb information. I don't care whether you read or you get oral briefings or whatever the method of, imbibing information. But he seems utterly indifferent to history, to assessments, analysis, or anything that's concrete, tangible, and would enable rational decision making. So that's a huge problem, and it's very hard to create a national security decision-making process that can correct for that. Having said that, I think we have suffered further because we have not even attempted to utilize the normal tools of national security decision-making. And one of the things that I hope comes through in Tough Love, as I talk about how we approached many of these challenges, particularly in the Obama administration, is that there is a set process for how things are supposed to be debated and analyzed and considered. And it doesn't necessarily yield the right answer, but you can be pretty sure that if you blow off the process, you're not going to get the right answer. And that process is meant to be bottom up. It's meant to involve experts. It's meant to involve, classified information, open source information, the knowledge and inputs of our experts, our ambassadors and other diplomats and development experts and military personnel and intelligence personnel serving in the field. And, it comes through a deputies committee and a principals committee and hopefully, a thoughtful set of options and recommendations provided to the president. None of that is happening. And it was particularly not happening, if I dare say, under John Bolton. I think that O'Brien is trying to reconstitute that. I don't know to the extent to which he's being successful. We read in the New York Times that it was his memo that included the Soleimani kill option. I would not have signed that memo. And you don't give any president, but particularly this president, a Chinese menu of, things to choose from where the risks and the consequences of the various options have not been fully analyzed. So I won't, just as a matter of principle, I'm not going to sit up here and slag on individual members of the president's national security team, even though I have my own strong views about several of them. But I will say that, I think we are in a more precarious position than when we had very seasoned experts as Secretary of Defense, as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and even as National Security Advisor than we are now, where many of these folks are green, or at least green in their role, and many of them come with a strong ideological.
Bill Press talking with Susan Rice, former National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador, and author of Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Alicia Garza, Alex Morgan, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.